The Life and Letters of John Muir, Volume 2, illustrated and annotated, written by William Frederick Badet.
How is his work being used post-2020? And I remember in 2018, when we released the Unruly Mystic John Muir film, we came to see Mike Wurtz at the University of the Pacific. We had a screening there with descendants of the Muir family. We also were showing the film with support of the Sierra Club. We were showing to Sierra Club members. And here we are a few years later, 2023, and things have really changed. But I think, the seed that John Muir planted is obvious to us. And I think his letters and his language has been kind of reinterpreted in terms of some of the cancel culture that occurred over the last couple of years, the Sierra Club's response to John Muir and this kind of pushback. And it's been interesting to kind of watch this happen. And I know it's impacted some of us more than others. But to go to Mike Wurtz and kind of say from an academic standpoint, what's the response been, and how is Muir being used now today?
I kind of see it as a pendulum that it had to swing the direction that it did during 2020 and 2021. We had to look at these things. We had to examine them, and even here at the University of Pacific, our symposium in 2022 focused on those issues. Okay. But I think now now that we've done that, and it's not like, hey, we paid lip service. I don't mean it in that sense. It's now we know that there's a lot to this, that history is nuanced. And as you hear over and over again, Muir is a complex character. It's like, and I think that's what's really important now is now we can kind of look at these things and say, yes, this is part of the story. And I think a real good example is the new book coming, Guardians of the Valley by Dean King, about Muir's relationship with Johnson. It's mentioned that, Muir had these relationships with Native Americans, but that's not what the whole book is about. And I think that's where we're at, is we're at this moment where we're kind of like looking at, we have a chance to look at everything. And then, to bring it back to the Life and Letters, is that we've laid it all out there. So much of what Muir was thinking is laid out there. And, it reminds me of what, just the fact that Muir's a quote machine. He just has these amazing quotes that you can just use everywhere. And, you see them on T-shirts and stuff. And that has not changed. That is, since 2020, those quotes are still there. His legacy, the things that he did, kind of like what Harold was talking about, this legacy of John Muir is still intact. I mean, we just need to realize there's a lot to the story, and we can't just tweet, this is John Muir, it's not tweetable. So, getting to the point of saying, okay, everything's complex, nuanced, we can't just sum things up real quickly. I think that's the best thing out of it.
And is there any insight in the letters that kind of you read before and then kind of looked at afterwards and gave you a perspective that was maybe different?
There's only a couple of passages. And again, it kind of comes back to the time and the place that, William Frederick Badet was putting this together. He wasn't thinking, oh, I wonder what John Muir felt of Native Americans and Blacks and things like that. He's just saying, okay, John Muir wrote this stuff. And it wasn't a focus at that time. It's especially interesting, as I mentioned earlier, it's like the 1920s, you have eugenics movements, you've got the conservation movement is over, there's points where things are kind of overlapping. And so, I guess what I'm saying is I wouldn't expect to find the types of things that we're looking at it in 2020, 2021, 23. We can't use that same lens that existed in 1923 and 24.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And I'm doing my broadcast from Cologne, Germany, and one of the things is Germans are very sensitive to the two world wars that they were responsible for, and they tend to think of themselves as Europeans, and then they think of themselves as the city that they're from, and then the third is, they're Germans. Which I think it's kind of something we can maybe take into consideration of how we think about nature, John Muir, and how people interact with nature.
Or like John Muir said, Earth, planet, universe, right?
Yeah.
He didn't say, he didn't characterize himself in these other ways. He said Earth, planet, universe. Now, granted, that was a long time ago, but yeah, that, to kind of understand the context, he's laying out the context for us right away.
So I'm gonna ask Stephen, because you've gone through the letters. You've been doing this longer, obviously, than I was. In terms of what you see in volume 1 and 2, and then how do you think those should be used in this kind of post-2020 world?
Well, I think they definitely give a picture of Muir's thoughts. I'm outdoors a lot, and sometimes not on the internet that much, except to post nature photos. So I don't follow all of the cultural trends, and culture changes so quickly. And every few years, there will be a new lens to look at every single historical figure. And every historical figure, including ourselves, will not meet up to whatever standards are there at the time. But there's an eternal wisdom, and I think that shines through. We all need something that goes beyond human society. How was the Earth for billions of years before we were here? And I think that John Muir is especially good at helping us to get some sense of what it was like. Similar to national parks and wilderness areas. Some people have criticized them, but they give us a little bit of a window into those billions of years before there was a human or any word on Earth. So reading the letters, the life and letters, you get some of his history and you get him talking with other people, but it's his love of the wilderness, the wilds that really comes out. But one thing that I love since 2022, I love the fact that Muir evolved. Every single one of us evolves from attitudes earlier in our life that had to be transformed. And to be human is to evolve. And so I think it's important. Every era judges things by their own standards as though they are the benchmark, but they will be judged by future generations. And this is something I always would tell my students. You can judge. I was teaching mysticism, medieval mysticism, and you can judge them by current standards. But remember, we will be judged too in our time. So I appreciate the fact that we all evolve, and John Muir did too. But the main thing about John Muir I value is that sense that he's in touch with the primordial, the sense of what was here before humans.
Yeah, well said. Thank you for sharing that, Stephen. So Harold, in terms of your perspective here, and I think what I'd like to maybe kind of phrase the question, Stephen's just kind of talked about seeing this evolution of John Muir evolving, and I'm curious, as when you were writing the epilogue, do you see those points as well, and could you point the reader to that within the volumes of the letters, or do you have to look outside?
That's a very interesting question, because a lot of times in recent years there's been this real depiction of Muir evolving. But what I found, it's like anyone, maybe it's more like cycles, because there are hints of kind of Muir's cosmic consciousness very early on. When he's in his early 20s or early 30s, doing the 1,000-mile walk, and meeting alligators for the first time, and getting malaria from mosquitoes, and then saying, well, they have a right to be here too. Even though he was personally very afraid of alligators, I mean, he was scared of them, but he told people, no, don't shoot them. They have a right to be there. He told Gifford Pinchot, don't shoot that rattlesnake that you saw at the Grand Canyon, because it has a right to be here as much as you do. So to me, there were times that earlier and later, and I think the biggest evocative thing of his biocentric view, which is very anti-anthropocentric, is that he would identify as people non-human people. He talked about plant people, animal people, insect people. It was very much like a Native American kind of viewpoint that he, through concurrent evolution, somehow, kind of came to that view. And for him, mankind was not the center of the universe. And so much of our Western philosophy is based on the idea of, mankind and the whole Judeo-Christian system is, for human beings. But what Muir was saying, it's not just about you. It's not about human beings purely. God loves all creatures, and all these creatures are also people. They're different kinds of people. They're not human people. They're animal people and plant people. So to me, that is something that's going to be retained as an appreciation from Muir far into the future, more than we can understand today, this anti-anthropocentric view. And we see little hints of it today. When we were first talking about climate change a few years ago, it was purely in terms of energy conservation and getting off of fossil fuels. Well, just in the last few years, there's been a greater attention to saying biodiversity is part of the solution to climate change. And, even Greta Thunberg said that, and E.O. Wilson said that. And we're discovering it's important to preserve the wild places, just as Muir told us to, for those more modern environmental crises that we see. And the only way to preserve, the animal people and plant people in the wilderness habitat is to think humans are not the end all and be all of creation. The other animals deserve to be here, and plants deserve to be here as well.
I'm kind of struggling on this one a little bit because I'm still working on something, and that's this idea of Muir and what did he think and when, and for how long did he think these things? And I think that if we want to talk about, if we want to go in and kind of understand what he was thinking, it's a little hard for us to kind of see exactly what he was thinking and when. The letters do a really good job, but we can find, that there's a number of opportunities that he, like, for example, let's just take My First Summer in the Sierra. He experienced that in 1869. Okay. What we have available of that was something that he created in when his original notebook, his original journal does not exist from that trip. He takes that and rewrites it 20 years after the fact. And then it actually gets published 40 years after the fact in 1911. And so I find it, it's interesting, when I think about Muir evolving, I'm still trying to wrap my head around that, because I think if he had evolved, I think maybe My First Summer in the Sierra would have looked different in 1911 than he may have saw it in 1869. I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. Stephen?
Yeah, he's a complex figure like all of us are. And I agree with Harold. It may be cycles. I do agree with Harold that it's his biocentric worldview that will continue on. Whatever we think of his views of other human beings, and whatever lens we're looking at the time, his view of biocentrism was far ahead of his time, and I think he's still ahead of our time, and that is what will last.
Yeah. Better put.
This has been The Life and Letters of John Muir, annotated and illustrated. Written by William Frederick Baudet. Narrated by Darren Roebuck. Copyright 2022 by Michael M. Conti.